Hello, and welcome to the first Guinea Pig Parkour Development Log video podcast. This is by no means the first development log, but up until this point, my commentary on the process of developing the game I'm working on, called Guinea Pig Parkour, has been pretty minimal. Up until this point, I've mostly just shown the artwork in progress and let it speak for itself. And while I think that's better than nothing, recently I decided that it's probably more interesting to see updates on the game and hear about the thought process that went behind creating those updates. This format will allow me to elaborate on the goals I have for the game, the direction I'm heading, features I want to add, and ideas I have along the way. The process so far has been a very interesting journey. I'm much more used to working on projects that are much smaller in scale, and in projects like that, the process is usually pretty straightforward. I'll come up with an idea, I'll work to implement that idea, and then I'll put the small project out into the world. Guinea Pig Parkour has been a much different experience. First, I have a much more ambitious goal that I'm seeking to achieve than any project I've undertaken so far. And as much as I've tried to plan in advance what direction the project will go in, as I work on it, I find myself adjusting, refining, and stumbling upon much better ideas than what I had originally laid out. It's not that I change direction, it's that by working on it over such a long period of time, it allowed me to create something that is closer to the original goal in ways I couldn't plan for, and I continually surprise myself by thinking I've done something in line with my original goal, spending a few months going in that direction, and then realizing how I've gone a bit off track. I would say most of this process of creating something, looking back on it, and realizing it was not quite in the right direction, and that I needed to go back and start again, is mostly just because of my inexperience. I have a strong vision of what I want to achieve, but this whole process has been me struggling to find out what path I must take to achieve it. I think once this game's done, if I were to make another game, it would take far less time to develop because I would have a better idea of how to find the path that would lead me to achieving my goal. So, in this podcast, I think there's a good opportunity to talk about what decisions I've made so far, as well as what I plan to do in the future, and what ideas have popped into my head along the way. So each podcast, I'll talk about a chunk of development and discuss the process for creating the final result. And what I'd also like to do is devote some podcasts to discussing all the various video games that have inspired me. And so what I might do is just have a playthrough of a game and talk about what features of the game I like and that perhaps inspired me to incorporate similar features into my game. Maybe what the game did that I wasn't a fan of and what I'll probably try to avoid in my game. And just generally describe my impressions of the game and how it's influenced what I'm working on. Inspiration from other games is a huge part of the process for me, so I think it's equally important to look at not only what I've made for the game, but also showcase those games that have made an impact on me. But in this first podcast, I think it would be appropriate to talk about the evolution of the character design to show how we've gotten to where we are currently. And the easiest way to talk about that is through the various run cycles I've created from the beginning of the project, and even before. So let's start with the very first run cycle. This is a run cycle from the very first game I made after I started studying animation. I have made various games starring Joe the guinea pig way back when I was in high school, and maybe in a future podcast I'll show some of that much earlier work and talk a little bit more about who the character Joe is and where he came from. But I can summarize it by saying that Joe was a guinea pig pet that I had as a child, that I drew comics about as a child through high school, and in high school I started developing little video games based on that comic. And years later, when I started going to school for animation, after not drawing comics about Joe for years, as a lark, I started drawing new comics about Joe called Guinea Something Good. And after that series was running for a while, I decided it would be fun to create a little arcade game starring Joe. The idea behind the arcade game really was just to have a project that I could complete from beginning to end so that I could get very comfortable with the process of making a game. Because even when I was still studying animation and thinking I was heading more in the direction of creating an animated series, I was still toying with the idea of making video games. So this is from the game Bounce or Die, which, as I said, was based on the Guinea Something Good comic strip. Now, my goal with this game was to just be very simple. Like I said, I just wanted a game that I could create from beginning to end and get comfortable with the process of making a game. So I chose to make an arcade game so that I could just make one level that you had to survive that was based on getting a high score, and it had very low resolution graphics. It was almost an 8-bit game, but all the assets weren't actually very consistent with what resolution I was using. So Joe's animations were actually at a lower resolution than the objects he interacted with. It was only after the game was completed that I really figured that out, that if I was going to do pixel art, I needed to figure out what resolution the scene would be in and create all the assets contained in that scene at that same resolution. But since this game was very minimal, the sprites were not only very minimal, but the animations were minimal as well. Each animation had 1 or 2 frames, and as you can see, this run cycle has only 2 frames and is a very simple looking pixel art drawing. So I successfully completed that game and put it on my website. And it wasn't until after I left school that I actually started working on the precursor to Guinea Pig Parkour. And this game was called Super Bunny Insurrection. The origin of this game is actually a bit odd because I was creating it in a way to solve a problem that I was presented with in my life. And so it was a little bit forced now that I look back on it, as far as I didn't have a clear vision for what the game was supposed to be or what I was trying to achieve. All I knew is I wanted to make a game that I could hopefully get kickstarted, because to put it into context, what happened was I was going to school for animation. I had a year left before I graduated, and the school loan provider I was using to pay for my tuition, for some reason at that time decided to stop supporting the school I was going to. And unfortunately, at that point, I was not in a position to secure another student loan. So they kind of screwed me. They let me take out enough money to go to school for just long enough to not complete the degree. And I have a very optimistic personality, so I was trying to figure out how I could, instead of being depressed about not being able to finish my degree, how I could use this as sort of an opportunity. And what I had realized is that I had a chunk of money left over from the loan that I hadn't used, and I realized I could use that money to live off of and develop a game, and I wouldn't have to start making payments on the loan for another 6 months or so. So those two things meant that I could live for about 6 months and focus all my time on the game. And my goal was that I could create a presentation that would lead to a successful Kickstarter. And from the Kickstarter, I could fund development time that I could finish the project and then go on to sell it. So I spent 6 months straight working really 8 to 10 hour days, maybe sometimes longer. Didn't really take any days off, and I just worked tirelessly at this project. Hindsight is 2020, and now looking back on it, I can see that I just didn't have a clear vision for what the game was. And, it's been 4 years since that time, so I like to think I've grown quite a bit since then, since I had just stopped my animation education at school. And I really needed a lot more practice. And I also didn't really understand the indie game market. I kind of thought that I could just put up a project and that it would get attention. I didn't really understand that you have to not only make something really compelling that stands out to people, but you have to kind of build your audience first before you can even start thinking about crowdfunding anything. People have to be invested. They won't just stumble upon it and then randomly become invested, unless it's just a brilliant idea, and I did not have a brilliant idea. So needless to say, after that 6 months of working tirelessly on the project, I failed to meet my Kickstarter goal. And that was pretty devastating at the time, but it's those moments of crisis that you learn the most from. And after that experience, I was definitely put off on making a video game. So it was probably another year or so before I even started thinking about the possibility of maybe making a game using what I had and trying to figure out a stronger idea. My idea basically for Super Bunny Insurrection was just a game based on my comic, which to anyone who didn't know my comic wasn't much of an idea. I did want to make really good animation in pixel art, and I do think the animation was adequate, but I was really only making animations using the barest minimal knowledge of animation techniques. I just hadn't had the time or practice at that point to do do much beyond pretty straightforward animation. Another big problem with that project was that I got hung up on this idea that popped into my mind in which objects in the background would sort of simulate 3D, like sort of a 2.5D game, so that when you ran by them, they would sort of turn in the background as they changed perspective. Unfortunately, that idea occurred to me halfway through development, and it really took up most of my time because I had to create these objects, these like pixel objects, and create like 20 versions of each background object to show how they transition from seeing them from the left side to seeing them dead center to seeing them on the right side. And it was so much work, and it just didn't really add anything to the game. Like, it was almost neat if you could notice it, but you run by the object so fast that most of the time you didn't even see what was happening. So that was a huge lesson, like that you can get sidetracked and focus on something that is so unimportant to the final product that no one will care about. So yeah, that whole experience was good. It really made me realize how important a clear vision is, and that you can't let yourself get sidetracked on things that fall outside of that vision. And so the first thing I knew when I reformulated the idea for the game, because it was a similar idea from Super Bunny Insurrection, in as far as I've always liked parkour-based moves in games like Aladdin for the Super Nintendo, or even like Super Mario 64. I love interacting with the environment in that way. So I knew I wanted to retain that, and I knew I wanted good animation, and if I could make it, great animation. But really, I wanted hand-drawn animation. I think I was just too intimidated to try that at the time when I made the Kickstarter. But a couple of years had passed. I had more practice doing animated shorts. I had spent 6 months making a frame-by-frame hand-drawn animated short, and that gave me a lot of practice. And so after that is when I decided that that's what I would make the game as. Because when I was a kid, that's what I always wanted to play. I always wanted to play a cartoon. And Super Nintendo games looked kind of like cartoons, and a lot of them really tried to emulate what a cartoon would look like, but they were all pixel-based and weren't really cartoons. And I was frustrated a little bit when 3D came along. I mean, I loved 3D. Mario 64 was one of my favorite games ever, but I thought 2D games would keep evolving and go past the pixel art phase and go into so that it felt more like you were playing a cartoon. And for the longest time, the only games that really did that were 2D fighting games. And there have been a few platforming games that have used hand-drawn animation, but it's still pretty rare. And so I figured out at that point that that's what I wanted to make. Like, that was a very clear goal that I had, was to make a game completely with hand-drawn animation, and really high quality hand-drawn animation. You know, I actually started with animation that was 12 frames per second, which is a pretty standard animation standard. Even Disney animation will go between 12 frames to 24 frames per second, depending on what they need for the scene. But in testing, I figured out that 12 frames per second doesn't look very smooth when you're running the game at 60 frames per second. There's a disconnect there. So it became clear to me at some point that I needed to do 24 frames per second. But before I realized that, I thought I could split the difference by doing 18 frames per second. I thought, well, 12 frames isn't enough, and 24 is a lot of work, so maybe I could split the difference at 18 frames. And these cycles here are 18 frames per second. The pixel art, Joe, that's at 12 frames per second. But these three here are all at 18 frames per second. And even that wasn't quite enough. It was only at 24 that I felt like it matched the game speed so that it didn't look jarring. But if we take a look at this first one, you can see that I started with the idea of having Joe be on all fours. And I thought what might happen is he might start on all fours, and then he might, as he picks up speed, maybe transition into a bipedal stance, or maybe he would do parkour moves from the four-legged stance. But I didn't really like it when it was all done. Didn't really look right. I didn't really enjoy playing it as a four-legged creature. So that's when I moved to this one. And with this one, I changed the design very slightly. So the previous one, Joe had a solid black dot as an eye. And in this one, I wanted to add a little more personality. So I added a little bit white to the eye and a little eyebrow. Now, changing Joe's character design, I'm always trepidatious about because I have such a long history with the character. So I always feel weird changing the character design. And Guinea Something Good really cemented the design that I made for that particular iteration of Joe. And over the years, I experimented with that design in Guinea Something Good, and I never got good feedback from it. People liked the original design, and I understood why for the purpose of that comic strip. It was very dry, and this sort of blank staring guinea pig, the way it was drawn, it just fit the tone of the comic strip. But for a game that focused on quality of animation, I knew I needed something with personality, with more personality. So this was my first attempt at that. But it didn't really look right. It looked kind of weird. I tried to give a little funny bounce to the movement and stuff, but it didn't look quite right. And so I came up with this design. And this design was really my attempt at making it look cuter and more like a guinea pig, giving it bigger ears, getting rid of the white to the eye and replacing it with a white shine on the eye. I thought that would be a good solution. So instead of having just a bland black dot, the thing is that guinea pigs, it's hard to see the whites of their eyes. You can see it when they turn their eyes and sometimes, but for the most part, when you think of a guinea pig, you don't really think of the whites of their eyes. So essentially what I'm doing is trying to create a caricature of a guinea pig so that it still says guinea pig at some level, but it's also a unique character. So I knew I wanted to have like stubby arms and legs to emphasize the sort of chubbiness of the character and to give it a cuter look with the big eye and the big ears and the small mouth. And that's the thing, I shrunk the nose, I made the eyes and ears bigger, made the arms and legs smaller, made him a bit chubbier, kept the eyebrow about the same. And this is the model I used for quite a while. Really, it looks like I used it for about 2 years because I made a bunch of animations in this style. I made the running animation, a few parkour moves, jumping. And so this was really the model I used for a long time. But what I noticed after a while was that this model didn't really look hand-drawn. It kind of looked like I was rotating pieces in Flash, which I wasn't doing. I was drawing every frame by hand, but for some reason didn't look that way. And the design just wasn't very interesting. Like, it's just a lot of brown. And so what I started thinking about in 2016 was the most iconic platformer characters are Mario and Sonic, obviously, and they both have blue and red in their design to have like a strong contrast against the background and to pop out at you. And my character is just this little brown tubby character, so it wasn't very interesting. And there wasn't a lot of dimension to the design. Like, his nose and his head are very basic, very cone-like basic. You can't really tell when his body's turning because everything's brown. So when his arms and legs switch sides, it's kind of a blur. All you can really see is what's happening on the outer edge of the body. There isn't any animation going on inside the body as far as the chest, the stomach. There's no turning there because it's just brown. So it was in 2016 that I started thinking of all these ideas and thinking about, okay, I want it to really say hand-drawn animation. I want it to have dimension. I want it to pop out at you. And that's when I came up with the idea of giving him a running outfit. It's Guinea Pig Parkour. Because this is the thing too, is that, like I said, Super Bunny Insurrection didn't have a clear focus. It was just a game based on my comic. But what I realized is that if you haven't read the comic, none of that means anything to you. So I needed to make a game that someone who had no idea who I was, who had no idea what Guinea Something Good was, which is, most people on the planet by a wide margin, that it would be something that they would catch their eye and they'd be interested in. So you need a compelling idea for that. And so a guinea pig in a jumpsuit, I think, is a funny image, and it immediately communicates guinea pig parkour. It's an acrobatic guinea pig. And then that allowed me to choose whatever color I wanted for the jumpsuit. So I experimented with different colors, but blue was ultimately the right choice because it's a good contrast against the sort of reddish hue of the brown and orange. Orange and blue are complementary colors. So that was a good contrast. And then the shoes and the hands, I tried some different color variations, but I didn't want anything else to contrast, so I thought a sort of very subtly grayish, reddish white would pop out from the rest but not create conflict with that color harmony of blue and orange. But as I said, the previous design, didn't have any dimension to it. It was very flat. It looked like a Flash object, even though it wasn't. And so I studied the Disney approach to drawing. I really looked at how they design their characters so that, Disney designs their characters in the 2D Disney animations in order for them to look like they have dimension. So they give them very round cheeks and they have a very specific way they render the nose. And everything about the character is emphasizing the dimension of it. So that's the approach I took with this drawing. So I went from one extreme to the other. And I liked this for a while, but in the end, it almost looked like a 3D model that I had drawn over or something. Like I was so precise with it that it didn't really have very much personality. It looked kind of boring. And the line work I did with a pencil tool in Flash, which is like a straight line with no line variation. And so that's very boring. Like the whole point of the game, this is the nice thing of having a clear vision for your game. So I just could take what I made and line it up with, does this line up with the vision that I had originally? And the vision that I had was a hand-drawn game. So you want every element of the game to reinforce that vision. Otherwise, you create sort of a gray mess. Like if everything's not supporting the vision, then the vision gets lost and people won't be able to tell what you're trying to do with the game. So one of the clearest things I wanted to do with the game is make a hand-drawn animated game. So having line work that had no line variation did not look hand-drawn. It looked like a computer did it. But then the other thing I realized is that I had another goal that I had for the game was that it's funny. I wanted to make a funny hand-drawn game. And what occurred to me is that I was basing my design on the style of Disney animated features, but those are designed that way in order to make those characters appear relatable in a serious way. Like they spent a long time trying to develop their characters so that you would empathize with them. And the movie that probably my favorite Disney animated movie that is a comedy and has a very different art direction is The Emperor's New Groove. And that thing, it's very stylized. Everything still has dimension to it, but it's just a very stylized design. And it's not made so that you empathize with the characters. It's made so that it reinforces the comedy. And that's what I realized. That's what I wanted to do. I want to reinforce the comedy. And I want to have the characters squash and stretch and pull apart and be zany. And you can't do that with this very highly detailed rendered character. It looked odd. So that's when I moved on to this design. This is the same exact run cycle as the previous one. I just took every frame and redrew it in a more stylized, simplified way. Much more of a caricature. Line art with line width variation. And very stylized. I had made his nose very pointy, made his cheeks pointy to contrast with a round body. And really at this point, I really thought I figured out the design. And I think I did. I think I really figured out after all these iterations, I stumbled upon what I was going for all along, which is a hand-drawn animated character with dimension, but stylized, designed to be funny, as well as to have cool animations with. So for, a couple months, I thought that was my last run cycle, but as I started working on other animations, I realized the final ingredient that I needed. And that was silliness. This is where it helped to look at other games. At this point, I was looking at a lot of other games that were inspirations to me. And one of those is Earthworm Jim. That's a huge inspiration. That is basically hand-drawn animation just made into pixel art. And what I noticed about that is that every animation has a lot of personality to it. So they took the most basic run cycle and they made it funny. And so that's what I needed to do. But I needed it to be funny in a way that showed what Joe was. What are his limitations as a character with tiny arms, a fat body, and these little legs? And I realized that a character like that, he's not going to swing his arm all the way back and all the way forward. He's going to have this little tiny arm movement because his arms are tiny. And all the work's going to be done in his legs, but his body being heavy is going to barely move off the ground. So there it is. That's the evolution of Joe's character design that you can see through the different run cycles I've made. This is definitely the last design Joe will have, and this will be his basic default run animation. However, I will be adding a dash run, like a faster run, that you'll be able to activate, but this will be the default run. And it's really important to get the run cycle down because really everything else is based around that run cycle. That's the animation you'll be using the most in the game. So it's important to nail that down so that every other animation that you make has a solid base to build from. All right, well, thanks for listening and watching. I hope that was interesting and provided some insight into the development of Joe the Guinea Pig's character design for Guinea Pig Parkour. I'm not sure how often I'll be making these podcasts, but I would like to do them somewhat regularly. And maybe next time I'll sit down and play one of the games that have been an inspiration for mine. I'll probably start with the Super Nintendo Aladdin game. And I'll just take this time at the end here as an opportunity to point you to my Patreon. The Patreon is really your opportunity to help me spend more time on the game. The more I can raise with Patreon, the more time I can put into the game. And of course, the more time I put into the game, the faster it will be released. So, even if you can throw in $1, it might not seem like much to you, but it does have a sort of cumulative effect where the more patrons there are, the more likely people will be to become patrons. So even beyond just seeing yourself as like, what's $1? $1, I've calculated it, $1 buys me 6 minutes of development time. So it's not nothing. $1 is important. But beyond that, it also actually pushes that snowball of momentum just a little bit as far as people signing up, people taking that leap to sign up. People like to sign up to things that are successful. And it's a bit ironic because the pages that need them the most, there's a psychological thing where they're less likely to sign up. I think it's that you kind of want to join in on what's going well. And so if you sign up for the Patreon, it kind of helps push mine closer to that point where it feels like a project that people want to participate in. And so, you can look at it both ways. You can look at it as $1 that helps me spend more time on the game, and you can look at it as sort of a showing of support that gives some social proof to the project. That's really what I'm talking about. It's a concept called social proof. And every patron is more social proof that when new people find out about the project and they go to the Patreon page, they'll see that it's something real, that something people are participating in it. So it's a snowball effect. The more of that we can get, the more we'll be able to get. And the reality is, if enough people became patrons at $1, you can look at other Patreons and you'll see people have hundreds of patrons. So even if you had $1 per patron and you had hundreds of patrons, added up, that could give me like an entire week per month to devote to the game. So, it adds up. It's all important. And if you're able to, it would be really cool if you decided to do that. Throw your support behind the game. Give me more time to develop it. Showcase to other people that this is a project worth supporting. And anyway, again, I thank you so much for listening to this, and I hope it was enjoyable, and I'll see you next time.